The carriage wheels stopped outside Whitmore Estate, and Duke William Harrington stepped down, smiling with another woman on his arm. He expected tears. He expected his wife to beg. Instead, Evelyn was already seated in the library, a single sheet of paper waiting on the desk before her. She did not rise. She did not cry. She simply lifted her eyes and said 4 words that made his smile disappear forever. If you're watching this story right now, hit subscribe and follow it to the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The carriage came up the long gravel drive just after 4 in the afternoon, and the first sound Evelyn Whitmore heard was laughter. Not her own, not the housekeeper's, his. She was standing at the tall window of the library when the sound reached her, and her hand, which had been resting on the edge of the writing desk, went still. Outside, the July sun sat low and heavy over the fields, and through the wavy old glass, she watched the carriage roll to a stop in front of the house. The horses blowing hard from the long ride up from the county road. William stepped down first. He always did. 8 months had not changed that about him, the way he moved like a man who expected the world to arrange itself around his arrival. He was tanned from travel, his coat dusted at the shoulders, and when he turned back toward the carriage door, he was smiling. Not the tired half-smile of a man returning home after a long absence. A real smile. Wide. Careless. Then he reached up a gloved hand, and a woman took it. She stepped down slowly, the way a woman steps down when she knows she is being watched and wants to be watched well. Her traveling dress was the pale blue of a summer sky, her bonnet trimmed in ribbon that had certainly not come from any shop in Virginia. She looked up at the house, at Evelyn's house, at Evelyn's father's house, and she smiled too. Evelyn did not move from the window. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the library door, and Thomas Reed's voice, careful and low. "Mrs. Harrington, they've arrived." "I can see that, Thomas. Shall I?" "No." Evelyn turned from the window at last. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced that these last 3 weeks, the way another woman might practice a hymn before Sunday service, quietly alone, until the words no longer trembled in her throat. "Tell Martha to see that a room is prepared for our guest. The east wing, furthest from the family quarters." Thomas hesitated. He was 50 years. In this house had known Evelyn since she was a girl. Visiting with her father, had watched her become mistress of it. He knew what silence like this meant in a woman like her. "And you, ma'am, will you receive them at the door?" "No." She smoothed the front of her dress, a plain gray traveling dress with no ribbon at all. "I will receive him here." She sat. She did not pace. She did not wring her hands or check her reflection in the small mirror by the mantel. She sat behind the wide oak desk that had been her father's, and she opened the drawer, and she drew out a single folded document, and she set it on the blotter before her, squared perfectly with the edge of the desk. Then she folded her hands on top of it, and waited. She could hear them in the entrance hall now. William's voice booming with the particular good cheer of a man who has spent 8 months getting exactly what he wanted. "Finest house in the county, darling, you'll see. My wife keeps it well, whatever else you might say of her." A woman's laugh, light and practiced. "I'm sure she does, William." "William. Not your grace. Not even the pretense of formality." Evelyn's jaw tightened just slightly, and then loosened again. She breathed out slowly through her nose. Footsteps came down the hall. She heard him pause outside the library door, the same door he'd walked through 1,000 times without knocking. And this time, he did knock 2 careless raps, more announcement than request, and then he pushed it open without waiting for an answer. He filled the doorway the way he always had. Tall, broad through the shoulders, his dark hair wind-blown from the ride. And there, just a step behind him, was Lady Caroline Ashford, 27 years old, golden-haired, and looking at Evelyn with an expression that was trying very hard to be pity, and mostly succeeding at curiosity. William's eyes swept the room. The desk, the chair, his wife sitting perfectly still behind it, and something flickered across his face. Not quite confusion. More like a man noticing for the first time in a long while that the ground beneath him did not feel entirely solid. "Evelyn." He recovered quickly, spreading his arms slightly, as though presenting himself for admiration. "Aren't you going to welcome me home?" "Welcome home, Your Grace." Her voice was even. Warm, even in the way that a closed door is warm compared to open winter air, a courtesy with nothing behind it. William's smile faltered for half a second before he caught it and pulled it back into place. "This is Lady Caroline Ashford," he said, stepping aside with a small flourish as though introducing a prize horse. "She'll be staying with us for the season. I trust you'll make her comfortable." "Of course." Evelyn's eyes moved to Caroline for the first time, and she did not look away, did not flinch, did not do any of the things William had clearly expected her to do. "Lady Ashford, I hope your journey was pleasant." Caroline blinked. Whatever she had prepared, for tears screaming a dramatic exit, this steady, unhurried courtesy was not it. It was, "Thank you." "Good." Evelyn's hands remained folded over the paper. "Thomas will show you to your room. I believe you'll find the east wing quite comfortable this time of year, cooler in the evenings." There was a beat of silence. William's smile had gone thin at the edges, now a man sensing a trap, but unable to locate it. "Evelyn, is something the matter with you? I've been gone 8 months, and you greet me like a tax collector." "Nothing is the matter with me, William." She said his name plainly, now no title at all, and watched him notice it. "But before you remove your coat, I need your signature." "My—" He laughed a short, disbelieving sound and glanced back at Caroline as though sharing a joke. "My signature. On what exactly has the cook run short on flour?" "Sit down, William. I don't believe I will." But he did not leave either. He stood in the doorway another moment, some old instinct telling him to stay, and then, almost against his own will, he crossed the room and lowered himself into the chair across from her, the one that had always been his father-in-law's years ago, when business was discussed in this room and not betrayal. Caroline lingered in the doorway. "Shall I?" "Stay," Evelyn said without looking at her. "You should hear this too." William's brow furrowed. He reached across the desk, careless, confident the way he reached for everything, and turned the document toward himself. Evelyn watched his eyes move across the first line. Agreement of separation and protection of the Duchess. The smile did not fade slowly. It vanished all at once, the way a candle goes out in a draft there and then simply not there. "What is this?" It was not a question. His voice had dropped, all the good cheer scraped away in an instant, replaced by something harder, something Evelyn remembered from years of small cruelties disguised as jokes, years of being talked over at his own dinner table. "It's exactly what it says it is." She kept her hands folded, kept her voice level. Inside her chest, her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain he could see her collar move with it, but her face gave nothing. 3 weeks of practice alone in this room at this desk, until the trembling had gone somewhere, she could no longer feel it. A separation agreement, and a protection clause ensuring that the lands and holdings brought into this marriage by my father remain mine, regardless of what becomes of the rest. "You can't be serious." "I am entirely serious." He shoved the paper away from himself as though it had burned his fingers, and stood so fast the chair scraped back hard against the floor. 8 months, Evelyn. I have been gone 8 months conducting business in Washington, building connections that will matter for this family for generations, and I come home to this. A piece of paper, a demand. "You went to Washington in November," Evelyn said quietly. "You were seen at 3 parties in Richmond by February. The Alexandria Gazette printed your name beside Lady Ashford's in April. I did not need to guess where you were conducting your business, William. I read the papers same as everyone else in this county." Caroline's face had gone pale by the doorway. "William, you told me—" "Not now, Caroline." He did not even turn to look at her. His eyes were locked on Evelyn, and for the first time in 8 months, in perhaps the whole of their marriage, Evelyn watched something like real uncertainty move across his face. "This is between my wife and myself." "Is it?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. I rather thought Lady Ashford was part of the arrangement now. You did introduce her as though she were staying the season. That is not the point. No, Evelyn agreed. The point is on the desk in front of you. Sign it. William and I will trouble you no further. You may keep your title, your season, your guest in the East Wing. I ask only for what is mine. He stared at her, as though seeing her for the first time in years. Really seeing her, not the quiet wife who kept his house, and poured his tea, and said nothing when he left for months at a stretch. Something behind his eyes was recalculating fast, the way a man recalculates when he realizes the ground he's standing on has already shifted beneath him, and he simply hadn't felt it move. You've had this drawn up, he said slowly. You've had a lawyer out here. I've had several conversations with several people. Evelyn said, over several months. You were not here to ask William, so I did not ask. And what exactly do you think you know? The question came out sharper than he intended. She could see it land wrong, even as he said it could see him wish briefly that he'd kept his voice steadier, and Evelyn allowed herself, for the first time since he'd walked through the door, the faintest curve of something that was not quite a smile. I know a great deal, William. She reached into the drawer again and drew out a second folder thinner than the first and set it beside the document, though she did not open it. Not yet. But we can discuss the particulars once you've signed. Or we can discuss the particulars first in front of your guest, and then you can decide whether you'd still like her standing in that doorway when we're through. Caroline's hand had gone to the frame of the door, gripping it. William, what is she talking about? Nothing. William said too quickly. She's talking about nothing. Evelyn, this is beneath you. Threats, papers, ultimatums, this isn't who you are. You're right, Evelyn said. It isn't who I was, but 8 months is a long time to sit alone in a house, William, with nothing to do but think about who I might become instead. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its long summer repertoire in the magnolia by the drive, indifferent to the silence inside. William's hands, Evelyn noticed, had curled slightly at his sides, not quite fists, but close. I'm not signing anything today, he said finally. I've been traveling since dawn. I am tired, I am hungry, and I will not be bullied in my own library by my own wife over a piece of paper she had drawn up in a fit of whatever this is, of course. Evelyn's tone did not change at all. She folded the document back along its crease unhurried, and returned it to the drawer, the second folder beside it. Take your time, William. I've had 8 months of practice waiting on you. A few more days will hardly trouble me. He turned and walked out without another word, and after a heartbeat's hesitation, Caroline followed him, casting one last uncertain glance back at the woman seated so calmly behind the desk, a glance Evelyn did not return. When the door clicked shut, Evelyn sat alone in the quiet library for a long moment. Then, and only then, did her folded hands begin very slightly to shake. She had not always been a woman who kept documents in locked drawers. 8 months ago, when William's carriage had rolled away from Whitmore Estate bound for Washington, Evelyn had stood on the front steps and watched it go, with something that still, if she was honest with herself, resembled hope. He had kissed her hand. He had told her he would write. He had said, "Look after the house, my dear, and I'll be home before the first frost." And she had believed him because at 28 years old, 3 years into a marriage that had never quite warmed the way she'd been told, marriages warmed, hope was still a habit she had not yet broken. The first letter came in December, short, businesslike. Weather in Washington is bitter. Negotiations proceed slowly. Do not expect me before spring. She had written back twice a week for 2 months before she stopped counting the letters she sent against the letters she received. By February, the ratio was 7-1. By March, she had simply stopped counting altogether, because counting made the silence worse, made it a wound she kept reopening with her own hand. It was Martha, the housekeeper, who first brought her the newspaper, folded to a particular page, set down on the breakfast table. Without comment, the way a person delivers bad news, they do not have the courage to say aloud. Evelyn had unfolded it slowly. A society column from Richmond. Duke William Harrington seen at the Ashford residence for the third time this season, in the company of Lady Caroline Ashford, described in the sort of breathless prose newspapers reserved for scandal they were pretending not to enjoy. She remembered sitting very still at that table, the coffee going cold in front of her, Martha hovering by the sideboard, not knowing whether to speak or withdraw. "Ma'am?" Martha had finally said, "You don't have to read that filth." "No." Evelyn had agreed. "I don't." But she had read it anyway. And then she had read the next one in March, and the one after that in April, each item a little more brazen than the last, until the county had stopped bothering to whisper about it at church and simply discussed it openly, the way people discuss weather or crops. A fact of the season, Duke Harrington and his lady in Richmond, poor Duchess Whitmore alone out at the estate. She remembered the exact Sunday it had changed something in her. Mrs. Pemberton from the neighboring estate, meaning to be kind, meaning to comfort, had taken Evelyn's hands after service, and said in a voice pitched to carry just slightly further than a whisper, "You poor dear, however do you bear it?" And Evelyn had smiled the same practiced warm-as-a-closed-door smile she would later use on William himself, and said, "I bear it very well, Mrs. Pemberton, thank you for asking," and had gone home that afternoon and sat in the library for 6 hours without moving, staring at nothing, until Thomas had finally come in at dusk to light the lamps and found her still sitting there in the dark. "Mrs. Harrington?" His voice had been gentle. Thomas Reed had served this family for 20 years. He had known Evelyn since she was 12 years old, visiting her father's business partner's estate for the first time, and something in him had never stopped seeing that girl even now. "Shall I bring you something to eat?" "Thomas." Evelyn had not looked up from the dark window. "How long have you managed this household's books?" A pause. "Since your father's time, ma'am, near 30 years. And in that time has any part of this estate's finances ever been kept from you?" Another pause longer this time. Thomas set down the lamp he was carrying. "Ma'am, I don't believe that's a question I ought to answer without knowing why you're asking it." "I'm asking," Evelyn had said, finally turning to face him, "because I intend to stop waiting, Thomas. I have spent 5 months waiting for letters that do not come, and a husband who has forgotten the road home. I am done with it. I want to know what this family owns. I want to know what it owes. And I want to know precisely what my husband has done with either while he has been away." Thomas had studied her for a long moment in the lamplight, and something in his weathered face had shifted, not surprise exactly, recognition maybe, as though he had been waiting a long while himself for her to ask. "There's a room, ma'am," he said slowly, "off the cellar stair. Your father kept the estate records there, deeds, ledgers, contracts going back to when he first built this house. His Grace had it locked some years back, not long after the wedding. I was told it was being reorganized. It has not been reorganized since." Evelyn had felt something cold move through her chest. "Locked? By whom?" "By His Grace, ma'am. I have never had the key." "Then we shall have to find another way in," Evelyn had said, and for the first time in 5 months her voice did not sound tired at all. It took 11 days to open that door. 11 days of quiet, careful work, done in the hours when the house was empty and no one would ask questions. A locksmith from the next county paid in coin and discretion, who asked no questions of a duchess wanting a locked door opened in her own home. When the door finally swung open, the room inside smelled of dust and old paper, of a decade left undisturbed, and Evelyn had stood in the doorway with a single candle and felt for a moment as though she were about to step into a version of her own marriage she had never been shown. "Ma'am," Thomas said behind her, "are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything, Thomas." She stepped inside. It took weeks to make sense of what she found: ledgers in 3 different hands deeds, with signatures that did not quite match themselves from one page to the next. Letters from creditors in Richmond and Alexandria, some polite, some considerably less so. Evelyn was no lawyer, no accountant, but she had been raised by a man who taught his only daughter to read a balance sheet the way other fathers taught their sons, because he had no son, and because he had never believed intelligence belonged to one sex more than the other. She sat in that cellar room night after night with a candle burning low and slowly, painfully. The shape of what William had done began to emerge from the dust like a photograph developing in a darkroom. He had borrowed against the Eastern fields that belonged by the terms of her father's will to her, not to him, using a signature that was close enough to her own to pass a careless clerk's inspection, but that she knew the moment she saw it she had never written. She sat with that page for a long time, her own forged name staring back up at her in ink, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. She found the wage ledger's next payments to the tenant farmers and laborers who worked the land entries that grew sparser and more irregular through the winter months. Men owed 3 months' pay, 4 with excuses scrawled in the margins in Thomas's careful hand funds not yet released by his grace. She thought of the families in the tenant cottages down past the tree line of children she had seen at the Christmas service in coats a size too small, and something that had been grief in her chest for 5 months began very slowly to turn into something else. And then there was the letter. It was tucked inside a ledger from 6 years past, folded small in handwriting she recognized instantly and had not seen in 3 years because the man who wrote it was dead. Her father's hand, written to a solicitor in Richmond, dated 4 months before her wedding. She read it once quickly, uncomprehending. Then she read it again slowly and felt the floor of the cellar room tilt beneath her, though she had not moved at all. The Harrington boys' family holds significant debt against their northern properties, as we discussed. I am prepared to settle these obligations in full as part of the marriage arrangement, on the condition that Evelyn's inheritance. The Eastern fields, the mill, and the Alexandria townhouse remain protected under separate title, held in her name alone, regardless of what may become of the marriage itself. I trust you understand my reasons. My daughter is not to know the particulars of this arrangement. She believes herself loved, and I would prefer she keep believing it for as long as believing it makes her happy. Evelyn sat very still in the candlelight, the letter trembling now in fingers that had stopped pretending to be steady, and understood all at once the shape of the last 3 years of her life. She had not been chosen. She had been arranged for her father settling debts, buying his daughter a title and a house, and a husband who came with an old name and a drowning inheritance, and protecting her in the only way he knew how, by hiding the Eastern fields, where William's hands could never quite reach them. He had known. Her father had known 3 years before the wedding exactly what kind of marriage he was building for her, and he had built it anyway. And then he had built a wall around one small piece of it to keep his daughter from ever standing entirely unprotected. She believes herself loved. Evelyn folded the letter along its old crease, her hands steadier now than they had been a moment before, steadier strangely than they had been in 5 months, and understood that grief, when it finally finishes breaking a person all the way down, does not always leave nothing behind. Sometimes, if a person is careful and patient and willing to sit alone in a cellar room with a candle for 11 weeks, grief leaves behind something else entirely. It leaves behind clarity. She thought of Mrs. Pemberton's pitying hands after church. "You poor dear. However do you bear it?" She thought of William's careless kiss on her hand 3 years ago, promising a life he had never intended to give her, because he had never needed to. Her father's money had already bought the estate's survival before William had said a single true word to her. She thought of the tenant families with unpaid wages of her own name, forged onto a loan she had never seen, of 8 months of silence answered finally by laughter in her own front hall, and a golden-haired woman on her husband's arm, and sitting there in the candlelight 28 years old, holding a dead man's letter that had just rewritten the story of her entire marriage. Evelyn Whitmore made a decision that would take her 3 more weeks, and one carefully worded document, and a great deal of quiet, careful courage to carry out. She was done being the poor dear that Virginia pitied. She intended instead to become the woman that Virginia remembered. The days that followed William's return did not go the way he expected them to. He had assumed Evelyn understood that the library confrontation was theater, a wife's wounded pride putting on a performance that would exhaust itself within a day or two, after which the household would settle back into its old rhythms. Evelyn managing the domestic affairs, William managing everything else. Caroline, a guest whose presence would simply become over time a fact of the house that no one discussed directly. He had lived his whole life assuming that other people's anger burned itself out eventually, if you simply waited long enough and smiled through it. He did not understand yet that Evelyn was no longer willing to wait for anything. On the second morning she was gone before breakfast and did not return until well after dark. William, informed of this by an uncomfortable Martha, demanded to know where his wife had gone, and Martha, loyal to Evelyn, in ways William had never bothered to notice or cultivate, said only that Mrs. Harrington had business in town. Her business was with Mr. Josiah Pratt, a solicitor with an office above the dry goods store in the county seat. A small, precise man with ink-stained fingers, who had until 3 weeks ago never handled a matter for the Whitmore Harrington estate at all. Evelyn had chosen him deliberately, not the family's usual solicitor, a man too closely tied to William's affairs to be entirely trusted, but a stranger to the family recommended by a cousin in Alexandria, a man with no history to protect and no favors owed. The forged signature, Pratt said, studying the loan document she had brought him, holding it up to the window light, is a serious matter, Mrs. Harrington. If this can be proven in a court of law— I don't intend to bring it to a court of law, Mr. Pratt. Evelyn sat very straight in the narrow chair across from his desk. Not yet. I intend to use it to ensure my husband signs the document I've already had drawn. And if he refuses to sign, then I will bring it to a court of law, Evelyn said, and a great many other things besides, and my husband may explain to a judge and to the county at large exactly how his signature came to be so remarkably similar to my own, on a loan against land that was never his to borrow against. Pratt studied her for a long moment over his spectacles, and something in his expression suggested he had not expected quite this composure from the subject of the county's most whispered-about marriage. You've done a great deal of work yourself, Mrs. Harrington. Most women in your position would have brought me a grievance and asked me to build the case. Most women in my position, Mr. Pratt, have not spent 5 months alone in a locked cellar room with nothing but candlelight and their father's ledgers for company. Evelyn's voice was even, but something flickered behind her eyes, not quite a smile, but close to one. I did not want a lawyer to build my case. I wanted a lawyer to tell me whether the case I had already built would hold. It will hold, Pratt said slowly. It will hold very well indeed. She returned home that evening to find William waiting in the front hall, arms crossed his face, carrying the particular irritation of a man unaccustomed to being kept in the dark about his own wife's movements. Where have you been? Attending to business, William, as you so often are. You went into town, alone, without so much as a word to me. I did not realize I required your permission to leave my own house. She removed her bonnet, unhurried, and handed it to Martha, who hovered nearby with the particular attentiveness of a servant who suspected she was about to witness something. You did not ask my permission for 8 months of absences, William. I did not think to extend you a courtesy you have never once extended me. This is not the same thing, and you know it. Is it not? Evelyn turned to face him fully now, and something in her stillness made him take an involuntary half-step back. Tell me, William, precisely how it differs. You left this house for 8 months in the company of another woman, spending, as I have now had occasion to discover, money that was never yours to spend on debts of your families, that my father settled before I ever knew your name. And I am meant to account to you for a single afternoon's errand. His jaw tightened. Behind him, at the top of the stairs, Caroline had appeared, drawn by the raised voices, and stood very still listening. You've been in the cellar, William said slowly. It was not a question. I have been in a great many rooms of my own house, William. I find I've developed rather a keen interest in where things are kept and why. Those records are private family matters. They are, in fact, my family's matters, Evelyn said. My father's ledgers, my father's letters, my father's land, William, which you appear to have mistaken at some point in these last 3 years for your own to spend as you please. For a moment, William said nothing at all. Evelyn watched something pass behind his eyes. Not quite fear, not yet, but the first cousin of it, the particular unease of a man realizing that the ground he stands on has been quietly surveyed by someone else, while his back was turned. "You're bluffing," he said finally, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Whatever you think you've found, Evelyn, you are not a solicitor. You do not understand what you're looking at." "I understand enough to have shown it to one," Evelyn said. "A Mr. Josiah Pratt in town. Perhaps you know the name." "I don't believe you do. He has never done business with you, William, which is precisely why I chose him." Something in William's face went very still. "You had no right." "I had every right," Evelyn said, and for the first time since he had walked through the door 2 days ago, her voice rose not to a shout, nothing so undignified as that, but with a force that filled the entrance hall and made Caroline at the top of the stairs take an unconscious step backward. "I had every right, William, because it is my name forged on that loan document. My name in a hand that is close enough to my own to have fooled a careless bank clerk in Alexandria, but not close enough to fool the woman whose signature it was supposed to be. Would you like to explain to me how that came to happen? Or shall I let Mr. Pratt explain it to a judge instead?" The silence that followed was long enough that the mockingbird outside the front window finished an entire verse of its evening song before anyone spoke again. "Sign the separation agreement," Evelyn said, quieter now, though no less firm. "Sign it, and I will consider the matter of the forged signature a private one settled between husband and wife, never to trouble a courtroom or a newspaper. Refuse, and I promise you, William, the county that once pitied me will have a great deal more than gossip about Lady Ashford to discuss over their Sunday dinners." William stared at her, really stared the way he had in the library 2 days before, as though trying to locate somewhere behind her calm gray eyes the wife he thought he had left behind 8 months ago. He did not find her. Evelyn watched him fail to find her and felt something in her chest that was not quite triumph, but stood very near it. "I need time," he said finally, and his voice had lost its earlier bluster entirely, "to consider this properly, to speak with my own solicitor." "You may have 3 days," Evelyn said. "After that, William, I will stop asking, and I will simply proceed." She turned and walked toward the stairs, and Caroline, still standing at the top of them, stepped back to let her pass, watching her with an expression that had sometime in the last several minutes shifted from curiosity into something closer to unease. Evelyn paused on the second step, and looked back once, not at William, but at Caroline. "I would advise you, Lady Ashford, to ask your host a great many questions in the coming days," she said. "About debts, about promises, about precisely what he intends to offer you once he no longer has a wife's fortune standing between himself and ruin." She did not wait for a response. She climbed the stairs to her own room, closed the door softly behind her, and sat down at the small writing desk by the window, her hands, for the first time in 3 days, entirely steady. Behind her, somewhere below, she could hear William's voice, low and urgent, and Caroline's sharper, now asking questions he did not seem to have ready answers for. Evelyn allowed herself at last a single long breath, the first true breath it felt like that she had taken since the carriage wheels first crunched up the gravel drive 3 days before. Then she drew a fresh sheet of paper toward her, dipped her pen, and began once again to write. The 3 days did not pass quietly. By the second morning, William had sent a rider to Richmond, and by the second evening, a stranger's carriage rolled up the drive. Not Caroline's kind, borrowed and beautiful, but a plain, hard-traveled coach belonging to a man named Ezra Colt Williams, family solicitor, for the better part of 15 years. Evelyn watched from the upstairs window as he climbed down, briefcase in hand, and felt something settle low and cold in her stomach. She was ready for him within the hour. "Mrs. Harrington." Colt bowed slightly when Thomas showed him into the drawing room, his voice smooth in the way of a man who had spent a career smoothing over other men's mistakes. "I understand there's been some misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding, Mr. Colt." Evelyn remained standing, which put him at a small, deliberate disadvantage, forced to look up at her rather than settle comfortably into a chair. "There has been a forgery. I imagine you're here to tell me it isn't so." Colt's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes recalculated quickly. "I'm here to review the documents in question, madam, and to ensure that whatever arrangement is reached protects the interests of both parties." "Both parties." Evelyn repeated the word slowly, as though tasting something sour. "How generous of you to include me among them, Mr. Colt, given that for 3 years I understood myself to have no interest in this marriage at all beyond keeping my husband's house and smiling at his guests." "Mrs. Harrington, sit down." Her voice cut cleanly through his practiced calm. "I have the loan documents. I have my father's letters. I have the wage ledgers showing 3 months of unpaid labor to families who have fed this county's tables for 2 generations. And I have Mr. Josiah Pratt, who has already reviewed each of them and confirmed in writing that the signature on the Alexandria loan is not mine." Something flickered in Colt's face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who had perhaps already suspected as much and hoped never to hear it confirmed aloud. "You've retained your own counsel," he said. "I have." "That was unwise, if I may say so, Mrs. Harrington. Family matters are best resolved within the family." "This family," Evelyn said, "has already been resolved without me for 8 months, Mr. Colt. I did not think it wise to wait for an invitation to participate in my own ruin." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Evelyn heard faintly footsteps pause outside the drawing-room door. William, she suspected, listening rather than entering, which told her more than anything he might have said aloud. Colt cleared his throat. "I would like to review the documents myself before any further steps are taken." "You may review copies," Evelyn said. "The originals remain with Mr. Pratt in a safe location, and will stay there until this matter is settled. I did not spend 11 weeks in a locked cellar room by candlelight to hand the evidence back to the very family that buried it there in the first place." For the first time, Colt's composure cracked just slightly at the corner of his mouth. "You are a very careful woman, Mrs. Harrington." "I have had to become one," Evelyn said, rather quickly. He left an hour later, and through the window, Evelyn watched him find William in the side yard, the 2 men speaking low and fast, William's hands moving in short, agitated gestures. She could not hear the words. She did not need to. The set of William's shoulders told her everything a man discovering piece by piece that the walls of his own house had learned to speak against him. She found Caroline in the garden the next morning, sitting alone on the stone bench beneath the old oak, a letter unopened in her lap. It was the first time the 2 women had been entirely alone since the carriage had rolled up the drive 4 days before. "Lady Ashford." Caroline startled quickly, folding the letter and tucking it into her sleeve, though not quickly enough to hide the seal, Richmond, and a hand Evelyn did not recognize. "Mrs. Harrington, I didn't hear you." "May I sit?" It was not really a question, and both women understood that, but Caroline nodded anyway, shifting slightly to make room. Her eyes wary, in a way they had not been 4 days ago when she had stepped down from that carriage, smiling like a woman who had already won something. "You've been asking questions," Evelyn said once she had settled. "I heard William shouting last night. Something about debts." Caroline's jaw tightened. "That's between William and myself. Of course." Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, the same gesture she had used across the desk from William 4 days before, and Caroline seemed to recognize it, some instinct in her going still. "I only wondered, Lady Ashford, whether he had yet told you about the loan against the Eastern Fields. The one that bears my signature, though I never held the pen that wrote it." Caroline's face went pale beneath her careful powder. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Evelyn's voice remained gentle, almost kind, and that gentleness seemed to unsettle Caroline more than anger would have. "I think you have begun to wonder these last few days why a man with a title, a grand house, and a wife of considerable inheritance needed to forge that same wife's signature in order to borrow money at all. I think you have begun to wonder what precisely is left of the fortune you were promised when he brought you here. He did not promise me." "Did he not?" Evelyn watched the words land, watched Caroline's carefully composed face falter for just a moment. "Lady Ashford, I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I think somewhere in the last 4 days, you have started asking yourself the very same questions I asked myself for 8 long months alone in this house while the county whispered about the poor forgotten wife. And I do not think you like the answers any better than I did." Caroline's hands twisted in her lap. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its earlier polish. "He told me the estate was struggling, that your father had left debts he was working to repair. He said once the arrangement with you was concluded properly, once matters were settled, we could—" She stopped herself. "Go on," Evelyn said quietly. "It doesn't matter." "It matters a great deal, Lady Ashford, because I think you were about to tell me that my husband promised you a future built on money that does not exist, secured by land he does not own, using a name, mine, that he forged onto legal documents, rather than simply asking me for what he needed. I think you were about to tell me that you are not so different from me. Only I have had 3 years and 8 months to learn what you are, only now beginning to see in 4 days." Caroline said nothing for a long moment. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears, but stood close to them. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone told me the truth too late to spare me the worst of it," Evelyn said, thinking of the letter in the cellar, her father's careful handwriting, 3 years of marriage, built on an arrangement she had never been permitted to understand. "I would rather you hear it now from me than learn it the way I did alone in the dark, long after the damage was already done." She rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts, and looked down at Caroline with something that was neither triumph nor cruelty, but a strange, aching kind of recognition. "He has until this evening to sign the agreement," she said. "After that, Lady Ashford, I intend to take this matter to a judge in the county seat, and everything, the forgery, the debts, the unpaid wages to families who have nothing left to lose by speaking honestly, will become a matter of public record. I would advise you to decide before then whether you wish to still be a guest in this house when that happens." She left Caroline sitting beneath the oak tree, the unopened letter still tucked in her sleeve, and did not look back. The evening deadline came and went, and William did not sign. Instead, at 9 o'clock, as the last light was draining out of the sky over the western fields, he appeared in the library doorway where Evelyn had been sitting for the better part of an hour, the separation agreement once again squared neatly on the desk before her. "I've spoken with Colt at length," William said, closing the door behind him with a care that struck Evelyn as more dangerous than his earlier bluster had been. "He tells me the forgery charge, if it went to a judge, would be difficult for you to prove absolutely. A signature can resemble another without malice. Clerks make errors. It would be your word against a great deal of reasonable doubt." Evelyn did not look up from the paper in front of her. "Is that so?" "It is." He crossed to the chair opposite her and sat unbidden. This time his earlier fury replaced by something colder, more calculating. "So, before you go running to a judge with accusations, you cannot fully prove Evelyn. I would ask you to consider what such a spectacle would cost you. Your name, your reputation, the very respectability you seem so determined to protect with this document of yours." "You believe I'm bluffing." "I believe," William said, leaning back, "that you are a clever woman who has spent 8 months alone with too much time to imagine herself a heroine in some dramatic novel. I believe that when the moment comes to actually stand before a judge and accuse your own husband of forgery, you will find your nerve rather less steady than it appears tonight in the privacy of your own library." Evelyn finally raised her eyes to meet his, and something in her expression made him go very still. "William," she said quietly, "do you remember the day you asked my father for my hand?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What does that have to do with—" "Answer me." "Of course I remember it." "Do you remember what he said to you before he gave his blessing?" William's brow furrowed, some old memory surfacing reluctantly. "He said he hoped I understood what I was taking on. That you were not a woman to be managed lightly." "He said that to warn you," Evelyn said. "I have often wondered these last 8 months why you never seemed to hear it as a warning at all. You heard it as a compliment to yourself, a challenge perhaps, something to be overcome and conquered. You never once considered that my father, who built this estate from nothing, and understood better than anyone alive how easily a fortune could be lost to a careless or cruel hand, was trying to tell you something true about his daughter." "Evelyn, I am not bluffing William." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I have already sent a formal complaint to the county magistrate, along with copies of the loan documents and Mr. Pratt's written assessment of the signature. It was delivered this afternoon while you were in the side yard with Mr. Colt discussing reasonable doubt. The magistrate has scheduled a preliminary hearing for 1 week from today." The color drained from William's face so quickly that for a moment Evelyn thought he might actually rise from the chair. "You had no right. I gave you 3 days," Evelyn said. "You spent them consulting a lawyer on how to convince me my own evidence was insufficient. I spent them ensuring it would not need to be. You'll destroy this family's name." "This family's name," Evelyn said, "was already being destroyed in every parlor and church pew in this county. William, by your own hand, long before I ever opened that cellar door. I did not create the scandal. I have simply decided I am no longer willing to be its silent victim." William stood abruptly, the chair scraping hard against the floor, and for one terrible moment, Evelyn thought he might do something she had never once in 3 years of marriage seen him do, raise his voice to something beyond argument or worse. But he only stood there breathing hard, his hands opening and closing at his sides, a man watching the last solid ground beneath him crumble away in real time. "What do you want?" he said finally, and his voice had gone hoarse. "What will make this stop?" "I told you 4 days ago." Evelyn slid the agreement across the desk toward him unhurried. "Sign the separation. Return what was forged from me, and I will withdraw the complaint before the hearing, and this matter will remain as I promised between husband and wife." William stared down at the document for a long moment. Then slowly he reached for the pen, and stopped. "There is something you don't know," he said quietly. And something in his tone made Evelyn's chest go tight. Some instinct warning her that whatever came next would not be a small thing. "Then tell me." William sat back down heavily, all the fight draining out of him at once, replaced by something that looked for the first time since he had stepped down from that carriage, almost like fear. "The Eastern Fields," he said. "The loan I took against them, it was not the only one, Evelyn. There is a mortgage on the house itself, on this house, taken out 18 months ago against the full estate, not merely your father's protected lands." The room went very quiet. "Explain that to me," Evelyn said, and her voice had gone dangerously soft. "Very slowly, William. There were debts before we married. Colt knows the full accounting my father's debts inherited when I took the title. Larger than you understand. I believed I could manage them quietly, repay them over time, and you would never need to know any of it. But the interest compounded faster than I could recover, and 18 months ago, when a payment came due that I could not otherwise meet, I mortgaged the house itself against a loan from a Richmond bank. All of it, Evelyn, not merely the Eastern Fields, the house, the grounds, everything your father built, and the protection in his will. Applied to lands held in your name alone," William said. "The house was never held in your name. It was always mine by the terms of the marriage, and so it was mine to mortgage." Evelyn sat perfectly still, her mind moving fast, now faster than her voice could keep pace with. "How much?" "Enough," William said quietly, "that if the note is called and I cannot repay it, we will lose the house entirely. Not merely my portion of it, Evelyn, all of it. The separation agreement you're asking me to sign protects your fields, your mill, your townhouse in Alexandria. It does nothing for this house. If the bank calls the note before I can find a way to repay it, you will have your protected inheritance, and you will have lost the home you grew up in besides." For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing at all. Somewhere outside, the mockingbird had gone quiet for the night, and the house around them seemed to hold its breath along with her. "When does the note come due?" she said finally. 90 days. "And you did not think," Evelyn said very quietly, "that this might have been worth mentioning 4 days ago when I first placed that agreement in front of you." "I thought," William said, and something in his voice cracked at last some careful composure, finally giving way, "that if you knew how badly I had failed to protect this family, you would leave immediately and take everything with you, and I would lose the house regardless, only faster, and with your fields gone besides my own ruin. I thought silence might buy me time to find a way through it." "Silence," Evelyn said, "has cost this family everything it was ever going to cost William. I have had quite enough of it." She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the fields beyond the glass fields that had been in her family for 3 generations, a house her father had built with his own hands before he ever had a daughter to leave it to. Behind her, she heard William's chair creak as he shifted, waiting. And for the first time in 8 months, she heard something in his silence that sounded less like arrogance and more like a man genuinely afraid of what he stood to lose. 90 days, she said finally, still facing the window. And how much would it take precisely to satisfy the note in full? William told her the figure. It was a staggering sum, more than the estate's yearly income several times over, more than William could hope to raise through any ordinary means in 90 days. Evelyn turned back to face him, and something in her expression had changed, had hardened into a kind of calculation Caroline would not have recognized from 4 days ago, when Evelyn had seemed to a careless observer nothing more than a quiet, wounded wife. "There is a way," she said slowly, "though you will not like it. Tell me, my father's mill on the Alexandria property. It has stood idle for 3 years since his death, but it is fully built, fully equipped on a river that has never once run dry. I have had an offer for it, a standing offer in fact, from a merchant consortium in Alexandria, made to me directly 6 months ago, when word first reached the city that the estate might be in difficulty. I refused it at the time. I did not yet understand why I might need to accept it." William's eyes widened slightly. "You never told me of this offer." "You were in Richmond at the time," Evelyn said, "in the company of Lady Ashford, and I did not imagine you particularly interested in hearing from your forgotten wife about business matters concerning property that, as you've just now informed me, was never yours to touch in the first place." The bitterness in her voice was quiet, but it landed hard, and William had the grace at least to look away from it. "If I accept that offer," Evelyn continued, "the proceeds would very nearly satisfy the mortgage in full." "Nearly, William? Not entirely." "What would you need from me to close the gap?" Evelyn considered him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat and businesslike. The voice, William realized with something like awe, of a woman who had spent 11 weeks teaching herself to read balance sheets by candlelight, and had somewhere in those weeks become rather good at it. "Full transparency," she said. "Every ledger, every debt, every arrangement made in this family's name for the last 5 years, laid open before me and before Mr. Pratt, with no further surprises sprung on me in the 11th hour of a crisis you have known about for 18 months, and chosen repeatedly not to mention. And your signature not merely on the separation agreement, William, but on a document granting me full oversight of this estate's finances until the mortgage is satisfied and the house is secure. I will not save this family's home, only to watch you mortgage it again in another 18 months while conducting business in Richmond." William's jaw tightened, old pride flaring briefly behind his eyes, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might refuse, might choose ruin over the particular humiliation of surrendering control of his own estate to his wife. But then something in him seemed to fold quietly, the way a man folds when he finally understands that pride has already cost him everything it was ever going to cost, and there is nothing left to protect by clinging to it further. "Agreed," he said quietly. "Then sign," Evelyn said, sliding both documents across the desk toward him, the separation agreement, and beneath it a second paper she had prepared in the quiet hours after Thomas had first shown her the locked cellar door, though she had not until this moment been entirely certain she would ever need it. William read the second document slowly, his face tightening with each line, and when he finally looked up, something almost like respect had entered his expression, buried beneath the wreckage of his pride. "You had this drawn up before you even knew about the mortgage," he said. "You were prepared for something like this." "I was prepared for the possibility that you had hidden something worse than a single forged signature," Evelyn said. "I did not know precisely what, William, but 8 months alone in a house with nothing but ledgers and silence teaches a woman not to be surprised by very much." He signed both documents without another word, his hand less steady than she had ever seen it, and when he set down the pen, something in the room seemed to shift, a weight lifting from one set of shoulders and settling heavier now onto another. "There is one more matter," Evelyn said, gathering the signed papers and squaring them neatly against the edge of the desk. "What?" "Lady Ashford," Evelyn said. "You will tell her the truth. All of it, the mortgage, the debt, the fact that whatever future you may have promised her was built on money that does not, and may soon entirely cease to exist. I will not have her remain in this house under false pretenses while I work to save it. She deserves better than that, William, whatever else she has done. She has." William stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You defend her? After everything?" "I do not defend her," Evelyn said. "I recognize her. She stepped down from that carriage 4 days ago, believing herself chosen, William, the way I once believed myself chosen 3 years ago, before I understood what my father's letter truly meant. I will not watch her learn the same lesson I learned alone in the dark months after it was already too late to matter." She left him sitting there in the library, the signed documents in her hand, and climbed the stairs to her own room, her legs suddenly unexpectedly unsteady beneath her. Not from fear, this time she realized, pausing at the top of the stairs to catch her breath, but from something else entirely. Something that felt for the first time in 8 long months almost like the beginning of solid ground. She did not yet know that Caroline was standing just inside the darkened hallway above, close enough to have heard every word, or that within the week a letter would arrive from Alexandria, not from the merchant consortium waiting on her answer about the mill, but from a name she had not seen in over a decade, a name that would unravel everything. She believed she had finally understood about her father's careful protective letter, and about the true reason William Harrington had been so certain 3 years ago that a quiet, watchful girl from Virginia would never think to look too closely at the ground beneath her own feet. Caroline did not sleep that night. She stood in the darkened hallway long after Evelyn's footsteps had faded up the stairs, her back pressed against the wall, her heart slamming so hard she was certain someone would hear it through the floorboards. The mortgage, the debt. Whatever future you may have promised her was built on money that does not, and may soon entirely cease to exist. She had come to Virginia believing herself chosen. Now she stood in a strange hallway, in a strange house, listening to the woman she had wronged defend her to the very man who had wronged them both, and something inside her chest cracked open in a way she did not yet have words for. By morning she had made a decision. She found William in the stable yard, saddling his horse for an early ride to town, and she did not wait for pleasantries. "Is it true?" William did not turn around immediately, his hands stilled on the girth strap. "Is what true, Caroline? Don't." Her voice shook, but she did not let it stop her. "I heard you last night. Through the hallway. The mortgage. The house. All of it. You told me your family's fortune was simply resting, William. Recovering from your father's mismanagement. You never once said the word ruin." He turned then, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something in his face that was not confidence. "It isn't as simple as, isn't it?" Caroline stepped closer, and her hands were trembling now, though her voice had steadied into something harder. "I left Richmond for you. I told my own father I intended to build a life here in Virginia with a man who loved me. My father asked me once before I left whether you had spoken of marriage, and I told him it was only a matter of time. Was I a fool, William? Tell me now. Was I simply a fool, or was I something else to you?" William's silence lasted a beat too long, and in that silence, Caroline felt the last of her illusions finish collapsing. "Say something," she whispered. "I never lied to you about loving you," he said finally, and even as the words left him, they sounded thin, rehearsed, the kind of sentence a man reaches for when he has run out of true ones. But Evelyn's inheritance, it was always meant to secure this family's future. I believed when I brought you here that matters between Evelyn and myself would resolve themselves quietly, that she would accept a settlement, and that in time what? Caroline's voice cracked. "In time you would marry me once she was gone, using money that belonged to her from an inheritance you had already stolen from beneath her. Do you hear yourself, William? Do you understand what you are describing?" He said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Caroline turned and walked back toward the house, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, despite the summer heat already pressing down over the fields, and she did not look back at him even once. The letter arrived from Alexandria 3 days later, delivered by a writer who had come 60 miles at speed, and Thomas brought it to Evelyn in the library with a particular gravity in his weathered face, that told her, before she had even broken the seal, that this was not an ordinary correspondence. "Who sent this, Thomas?" "A Mr. Nathaniel Reeves, ma'am. Solicitor. He says he handled matters for your father some years back before you were born, and that he read of the mill offer through the Alexandria trading circles and felt it his duty to write to you directly before any transaction was concluded." Evelyn broke the seal with unsteady fingers and read, "Mrs. Harrington, I write to you as a man who once held your father's confidence in matters of considerable delicacy and who feels a duty now that certain circumstances have come to my attention to share information. Your father may not have lived long enough to share with you himself. The consortium that has offered to purchase your mill on the Alexandria property is not, as it presents itself, an independent group of merchants. It is a holding company, controlled in its majority by the Ashford family of Richmond, the same family, I understand, to which Lady Caroline Ashford belongs. Further, madam, I feel obligated to inform you that the mortgage currently held against Whitmore Estate, the note your husband describes as owed to a Richmond bank, was as of 4 months ago purchased from that bank by the Ashford family directly. Lord Ashford has held the note against your family home since March of this year. I do not know the full extent of what your husband understood when he began his acquaintance with Lady Ashford, but I would be doing you a disservice, madam, if I allowed you to proceed with the sale of your mill to that consortium without understanding precisely whose hands you would be placing your remaining fortune into. I remain as I was to your late father, your servant in this matter, Nathaniel Reeves." Evelyn read the letter twice, and then a third time, her hands going cold, despite the warmth of the July morning, pressing through the library windows. Lord Ashford held the mortgage. Lord Ashford's daughter had arrived on William's arm 4 days ago, smiling, golden-haired, utterly unaware, or perhaps not entirely unaware, that her own family held the note that could destroy the very estate she had come to claim a place in. It was not chance. William had not simply fallen into an affair with a pretty woman from Richmond society. He had courted the daughter of the man who owned his debt, hoping Evelyn understood now with a clarity that made her stomach turn, hoping to marry into forgiveness. Hoping that whatever affection grew between himself and Caroline might soften Lord Ashford's demand for repayment, might buy him time, might eventually buy him out of the very ruin his own recklessness had built. She had believed these last week that William's betrayal was one of simple weakness, a man tired of his wife drawn to someone new, careless with the consequences. She understood now that it had never been simple at all. It had been calculated, cold, and far crueler than she had allowed herself to imagine. And Caroline, who had stood in the garden 3 days ago with an unopened letter tucked into her sleeve, who had asked William with such raw uncertainty in her voice, "Why are you telling me this?" Caroline had no idea. Evelyn was certain of it now. Whatever role her father's money played in this scheme, Caroline herself had walked into this house believing she was chosen for love exactly as Evelyn once had. She folded the letter carefully and sat very still for a long moment, the weight of it settling over her like a stone. Then she rose and went to find Thomas. "Send word to Mr. Pratt," she said. "Tell him I need to see him today, not tomorrow. And Thomas." She paused at the door, something hardening in her face that had not been there a week ago. "Find out whether Lord Ashford himself is expected in Virginia any time soon. I have a feeling, given what I've just learned, that he may already be closer than any of us realize." He was closer than any of them realized. Lord Ashford arrived at Whitmore Estate 4 days later, unannounced, his carriage rolling up the same gravel drive Williams had rolled up 2 weeks before, though this time there was no laughter preceding it. Evelyn watched from the same library window, and felt something in her chest go very still and very focused, the way a hand goes still just before it closes around something it has been reaching for a long while. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. And when Thomas showed him into the library, his eyes moved over Evelyn with an assessment that was neither warm nor unkind, simply thorough, the look of a man doing sums. "Mrs. Harrington." He inclined his head. "I understand my daughter has been a guest in your home these past 2 weeks. She has, my lord." Evelyn did not rise from behind the desk. though I confess I did not expect the pleasure of meeting her father quite so soon. I received a letter, Lord Ashford said, from a Mr. Nathaniel Reeves informing me that certain financial arrangements of mine had become entangled rather more publicly than I would prefer with a scandal already well known throughout 2 counties. I came to see for myself precisely how entangled. Then you already know, Evelyn said carefully, that your family holds the mortgage against this house. I know it very well, madam. I purchased that note myself 4 months ago at a favorable rate, believing it a sound investment against a titled estate with a long and respectable history. Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite embarrassment, but close to it. I did not know until considerably more recently that my own daughter had taken up residence in the house whose debt I held. Nor did I know the particular circumstances under which your husband had invited her here. And now that you do know... Lord Ashford was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Evelyn hold very still, refusing to look away first. My daughter tells me, he said finally, that your husband courted her attention for the better part of a year before ever bringing her to Virginia. Dinners in Richmond, letters, a great deal of careful, patient charm. His jaw tightened. I confess I did not think to question his motives closely enough, Mrs. Harrington. I assumed a duke's interest in my daughter was at minimum sincere, whatever else it might also have been. I did not imagine it calculated quite so precisely around the note I happened to be holding against his estate. You did not know he was courting your goodwill as much as your daughter? No, Lord Ashford said, and something bitter entered his voice now. I did not know that at all. And I find, Mrs. Harrington, now that I do know it, that I am considerably less inclined toward patience regarding repayment of that note than I might otherwise have been. Evelyn felt something shift in the room. A door opening. She had not expected an ally arriving from a direction she had not anticipated. My lord, she said slowly, I wonder if you and I might have a great deal to discuss. They spoke for 2 hours. By the end of it, Evelyn understood the full shape of what William had built and what it would take to unbuild it, and Lord Ashford understood with a clarity that visibly cost him something exactly how thoroughly his daughter had been used as a piece on a board she never knew she was playing on. There is to be a gathering, Evelyn said near the end of their conversation. William arranged it before any of this came to light. A summer supper guests from 3 counties meant originally, I believe, to introduce Lady Ashford properly to Virginia society. He has not yet cancelled it, though I suspect he no longer knows quite what purpose it now serves. And you intend to use it? I intend, Evelyn said, to ensure that whatever purpose William believes that evening will serve, the truth serves a different one entirely. Lord Ashford studied her for a long moment, and something that might have been respect entered his weathered face. You are a formidable woman, Mrs. Harrington. I begin to understand why your husband found it necessary to forge your signature rather than simply ask for your cooperation. He never once considered asking, Evelyn said quietly. That has rather been the trouble with this marriage from its very first day. The evening of the gathering arrived hot and still, the kind of Virginia summer evening that pressed down heavy even after the sun had gone, and Evelyn dressed for it with a care she had not taken in months. Not for William's sake, and not even entirely for her own, but because she understood walking down the stairs that evening that every eye in that room would be measuring her, and she intended to give them nothing to measure but composure. The drawing room and adjoining hall were full by 8 o'clock. Neighbors, county families, a scattering of Richmond acquaintances William had invited weeks ago before any of this had begun to unravel. Evelyn moved among them with practiced grace, accepting compliments on the evening's arrangements, deflecting careful, probing questions about her husband's long absence with the same warm, closed-door courtesy she had given him on the day he returned. She found William near the center of the room, Caroline at his side, and something in the set of his shoulders told her he had decided in the days since Lord Ashford's visit to gamble everything on brazenness rather than retreat. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried easily over the gathered crowd as he raised his glass, and Evelyn felt her whole body go still, understanding immediately what was coming. I have an announcement I believe some of you have long suspected. William, Evelyn's voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmur of the room. "I would think carefully before you continue." He did not look at her. "My marriage to Evelyn has for some time now existed in name only. I do not believe it dishonors her to say so plainly, before friends who have watched this county's gossip circle her for months regardless." A murmur moved through the room, guests exchanging glances. "I intend in the coming season to seek a formal end to that marriage, and I hope in time that all of you will welcome Lady Caroline Ashford as the future mistress of this house." The room had gone very quiet. Somewhere near the back, a glass clinked softly against a tray, absurdly loud in the silence. Caroline's face had gone white. Evelyn saw her hand tighten around William's arm, not in triumph, but in something closer to panic. Her eyes darting toward the doorway, as though searching for an escape that did not exist. Evelyn stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every eye in the room was already fixed on her, waiting, and she let the silence stretch just long enough to be unbearable before she spoke. "Before you announce my replacement to this county, William," she said, "perhaps you should sign the document that allows you to keep one." She set the folder on the nearest table unhurried and opened it. "For those of you gathered here who have wondered these past 8 months why the Duke's wife seemed so quiet, so patient, so willing to endure his absence without complaint, I confess the answer is rather less flattering to him than the gossip has suggested." Her eyes swept the room. "I was not enduring anything. I was reading. Ledgers, letters, a mortgage document bearing my own signature in a hand that was not my own, secured against land I never agreed to risk." A gasp moved through the gathered guests. William's face had gone the color of ash. "Evelyn, this is not the place." "It is precisely the place," Evelyn said, "given that you chose it as the place to announce my replacement, Mr. Pratt." She turned toward the doorway, and the small, precise solicitor stepped forward from where he had been waiting, a folder of his own tucked under his arm. "Would you be so kind as to confirm for our guests what you found upon examining the signature on the Alexandria loan?" "I would." Pratt's voice was calm, professional, utterly devastating in its plainness. "The signature is a forgery. A skilled one, but a forgery nonetheless executed to closely resemble Mrs. Harrington's hand without being drawn by it." The room erupted into low, urgent murmuring. William took a step forward, his composure finally cracking entirely. "This is a private matter, and I will not have it." "You made it a public matter," Evelyn said, "the moment you announced my replacement in front of 40 guests, William. I am only ensuring they have the whole story rather than the half you intended to give them." Lord Ashford stepped forward from near the far wall, and the room's attention swung toward him with a fresh wave of murmurs, the sudden dawning realization among the guests that this was not simply a family quarrel, but something with considerably higher stakes attached. "I believe I can add something to this account," he said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man well known and well respected throughout Richmond society. "I hold the mortgage against this house, Duke Harrington. I purchased it in good faith 4 months ago. I did not know until very recently that you had spent the better part of a year courting my daughter's affections, while simultaneously courting my goodwill as your creditor, hoping I can only assume that whatever regard grew between us might soften my demand for repayment." Caroline made a small, strangled sound beside him, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Father." "I am sorry, Caroline." Lord Ashford's voice gentled just slightly as he looked at his daughter. "I did not see it either, not until Mrs. Harrington's solicitor wrote to me. I do not think either of us was meant to see it, not until it was far too late to matter." Caroline turned to William, and whatever remained of the composure she had carried into that room dissolved entirely. "You used me." Her voice shook, rising now, careless of the 40 witnesses around them. "You used my father's money to save yourself, and you used me to reach it. Everything you told me, every dinner, every letter, every promise of a future together. Was it ever real, William? Any of it? Or was I simply the easiest door into my father's ledger that you could find?" William said nothing. His silence in front of 40 guests, in front of the woman he had promised a future, and the wife he had forged into ruin, was its own answer. and Evelyn watched it land on Caroline like a physical blow. "I want to go home," Caroline said to no one in particular, her voice small now, stripped of everything performative it had carried since the day she stepped down from that carriage. "You will," her father said quietly, "tonight." The room had gone entirely silent now, every guest frozen in the particular fascinated horror of watching a scandal unfold in real time rather than hearing it secondhand over Sunday dinner weeks later. Evelyn stood very still at the center of it, the folder still open on the table beside her, and felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. Not triumph, not quite, but something steadier. Something that felt for the first time in 8 months, like solid ground beneath her at last. William turned to her, and whatever remained of his composure had entirely collapsed, replaced by something raw and desperate that she had never once seen on his face in 3 years of marriage. "Evelyn, please. Not like this. Not in front of everyone." "You chose this room, William," Evelyn said quietly. "You chose this moment. I have simply chosen to make certain it told the truth, rather than the story you intended it to tell." She reached into the folder and drew out the separation agreement, the same one that had sat on her desk for 2 weeks now, gathering nothing but his refusal, and set it on the table in the center of the room, in front of every guest, in front of Lord Ashford, in front of Caroline's shattered composure and William's collapsing pride. "Sign it now," she said. "Here, in front of everyone who just watched you try to erase me from my own home. Or refuse, William, and let every person in this room watch you explain in detail precisely why a duke would rather forge his wife's signature and mortgage her father's house than simply ask her for a divorce like an honest man." The silence stretched long enough that Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the low, urgent whispers moving through the guests near the back of the room. Could hear Caroline's quiet, broken breathing beside her father. William looked down at the document, then at the room full of faces watching him. Then finally, at Evelyn really looking at her. She realized for the first time, perhaps in the whole of their marriage, seeing not the quiet wife he had married for her father's fortune, but the woman standing in front of him now, who had built her own case, found her own solicitor, secured her own allies, and brought his entire carefully constructed deception down around him in the span of a single evening. He reached for the pen on the table, and then abruptly he stopped, his hand hovering just above the paper, his eyes lifting to hers with something in them that was not quite pleading and not quite anger, but some raw, cornered mixture of both. "If I sign this," he said low enough now that only she could hear it clearly over the murmuring room, "you understand there is no version of this that leaves me anything at all." The room did not breathe. Evelyn held William's gaze, and she did not look away, and she did not soften the answer he was asking her, without words to soften. "No," she said quietly. "There is no version of this that leaves you anything at all, William. You saw to that yourself 18 months ago, the day you decided silence was easier than honesty." Something in his face broke. Then, not dramatically, not with the raised voice she had almost expected, but quietly, the way a dam breaks first in hairline cracks before the whole structure gives. He picked up the pen. He signed the separation agreement first, his hand moving in short, hard strokes, and then beneath it, the second document. Lord Ashford's own solicitor had drawn up that afternoon, at Evelyn's request, an accounting of the mortgage, a formal acknowledgement of the forged signature, a timeline for repayment that no longer depended on William's word alone, but on ledgers Evelyn herself would now oversee. When he set the pen down, the room exhaled all at once, 40 guests releasing a breath they had not realized they were holding, and the murmuring that followed was no longer curious. It was something closer to reverence, the particular hush that follows watching a powerful man brought low in a single evening by a woman everyone in that room had until tonight quietly pitied. "It's done," William said, and his voice had none of the command it carried 2 weeks ago in that same library. It sounded instead like a man reading his own obituary aloud. "It's begun," Evelyn corrected him, gathering the signed documents with steady hands. "There is still the matter of the mortgage, William. Signing this paper does not make 90 days into 91. Lord Ashford stepped forward again, and the room's attention swung toward him, still hungry for whatever came next. On that matter, Mrs. Harrington, I believe you and I still have business to conclude, business that no longer requires your husband's involvement at all given the circumstances. I would welcome that, my lord. Evelyn inclined her head toward him, and something passed between them that was not quite friendship, but was perhaps the beginning of trust. Though I would ask that we discuss it somewhere rather quieter than a room full of my neighbors. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the gathered guests, breaking some of the terrible tension that had held the room fast for the last several minutes. And slowly, guests began to murmur their way toward the doors. Some offering Evelyn quiet, startled words of support as they passed others, simply eager to be the first to carry the story back to their own supper tables. Evelyn accepted each murmured word with the same steady grace she had carried through the entire evening, though inside her chest, her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Caroline did not leave with the departing guests. She stood very still beside her father, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands twisted so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. When the room had finally emptied, leaving only Evelyn, William, Caroline, Lord Ashford, and Thomas, hovering discreetly near the door, Caroline finally lifted her eyes. "I would like to speak with you," she said to Evelyn. "Alone, if I might." William opened his mouth as though to object, some last flicker of proprietary instinct rising in him even now, but Lord Ashford's hand on his daughter's shoulder, and the look he gave William alongside it, silenced whatever protest William might have made. "Of course," Evelyn said. They walked out onto the side porch together, away from the lamplight and the low murmur of Thomas beginning to see the last guests to their carriages, and for a long moment, neither woman spoke at all. The night air had cooled at last, the heavy summer heat finally breaking, and somewhere out past the fields, a whip-poor-will had begun its long, repetitive call. "I owe you an apology," Caroline said finally. "I should have offered it days ago in the garden when you first tried to warn me. Instead, I told myself you were bitter, jealous, a woman scorned saying whatever she could to frighten me away from a happiness she no longer had for herself." "I understand why you thought that," Evelyn said. "I might have thought the same in your position." "Would you have?" Caroline turned to look at her directly. "I don't think so, Mrs. Harrington. I think you would have asked questions from the very first day. I think you would have wondered why a duke needed to travel all the way to Richmond to find a wife when Virginia is full of families with daughters. I never once asked myself that question. I simply believed I had been chosen, and I let that belief carry me all the way here into another woman's house, without ever once wondering what it might have cost her." "You were not the one who cost me anything," Evelyn said quietly. "William made that choice long before he ever met you. You were simply the tool he chose to make it with." Caroline's composure finally cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking silently for a long moment, before she managed to speak again. "I loved him. I know that must sound foolish to you after everything, but I did. I believed every word he told me, and I think some part of me still wants to believe. Some of it must have been true, because the alternative is that I gave a year of my life to a man who saw me only as a door into my father's money. I understand that wanting," Evelyn said. "I carried it myself for 3 years. I wanted to believe my marriage had been built on something more than my father's debts and William's need. It took me 8 months alone in this house and a locked room full of ledgers to finally stop wanting it enough to see the truth clearly." "And now that you see it," Caroline said, "does it stop hurting?" Evelyn considered the question for a long moment, honestly, rather than offering the easy comfort Caroline was perhaps hoping for. "No," she said finally. "Not entirely. But it stops being the only thing you feel. There is grief, and there is also clarity. Freedom, even strange as that word feels to say aloud tonight. I think in time you will find both waiting for you too, Lady Ashford, once the hurt has had its say." Caroline wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, an unguarded, almost childlike gesture that made her look for a moment considerably younger than 27. "My father says we'll leave for Richmond tomorrow morning. He's furious with William. Furious with himself too, I think, for not seeing it sooner." Your father is a good man to come as quickly as he did once he understood. He loves me, Caroline said simply. Whatever else is true tonight, I still have that. She looked out at the dark fields for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something more resolved. I hope you're able to keep this house, Mrs. Harrington, whatever it costs you to do it. I think watching you tonight, I understood something I didn't understand 2 weeks ago when I stepped down from that carriage, smiling at you like a fool. What's that? That a woman who has learned to fight for herself is a far more dangerous thing than a woman who's simply been wronged, Caroline said. I don't think William ever understood the difference until it was already too late for him. She left before dawn the next morning, her father's carriage rolling back down the same gravel drive it had climbed only hours before, and Evelyn watching from the same library window. She had watched William's carriage arrive from 2 weeks earlier, felt something unexpected settle in her chest as it disappeared around the bend in the road, not triumph and not quite forgiveness, but something adjacent to both. A recognition that the woman leaving in that carriage was not in the end her enemy at all. Only another casualty of the same careless hand.
Gentlemen.
The days that followed moved faster than Evelyn had time to properly feel them. Mr. Pratt arrived the morning after the gathering with a satchel full of documents and a grim businesslike energy that suited the scale of what needed doing. Lord Ashford, true to his word, remained in the county 3 additional days before returning to Richmond, and in those 3 days, he and Evelyn worked out terms for the mortgage that bore almost no resemblance to the trap William had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, walked into. I will not pretend this is charity, Mrs. Harrington, Lord Ashford said, on the final morning of his visit, seated across from her in the same library, where William had once tried to convince her that reasonable doubt would save him. I hold a note and I expect it repaid, but I will extend the terms to 18 months rather than 90 days at a fair rate of interest, given the particular circumstances under which the original arrangement was made. That is more generosity than I expected, my lord. It is less generosity than you might think, he said with the faint dry humor of a man who had spent a lifetime softening business into pleasantries. I have no wish for my name to be associated even at a distance with a scandal built on forgery and deception. Extending you fair terms costs me very little and spares me a great deal of unpleasant talk in Richmond drawing rooms. Consider it self-interest dressed as kindness if you like. Most good business arrangements are exactly that. Then I accept it gladly, self-interest and all. He studied her for a moment before rising to take his leave. Your father would be proud of you, Mrs. Harrington, though I never had the pleasure of knowing him well. Few women I have met in business or otherwise negotiate with the clarity you've shown these past 3 days. My father taught me to read a ledger before he taught me to dance, Evelyn said. I did not understand as a girl why that mattered more than the dancing. I understand it very well now. Hoy. William did not leave the house immediately, though the terms of the separation agreement gave him little enough reason to stay. He lingered in a guest room on the far side of the house, the same wing Evelyn noted with some bitter irony, where Caroline had briefly been housed, and for the first week after the gathering, he said almost nothing to her at all, moving through the halls like a man who had lost not merely his authority, but some fundamental sense of who he was without it. It was Thomas who finally brought her the news a week later, that William had begun making inquiries about a position, not a grand one, nothing befitting a duke, but a modest role, managing shipping accounts for a merchant house in Richmond. Secured, Thomas understood through the reluctant intervention of a distant cousin, who still felt some family obligation toward him. Evelyn found him in the stable yard that evening, saddling the same horse he had been saddling the morning Caroline confronted him about the mortgage. Though this time, his hands moved without their usual careless confidence. You're leaving. Tomorrow. William did not turn around. I've secured a position in Richmond. It isn't much, certainly nothing befitting the title I still apparently retain, though I suspect that will feel like a rather hollow inheritance from now on. It's more than many men in your position would manage to secure at all. Is that meant to be a kindness? It's meant to be the truth, Evelyn said. I have no wish to see you destroyed entirely, William, whatever you may believe of me, after these past weeks. He turned then, and something in his face had changed since the night of the gathering. Some of the arrogance burned away, leaving behind a rawness she had not expected to see and did not entirely trust. "I don't understand you," he said quietly. "You could have ruined me completely. The forgery alone would have seen me in a courtroom, my name in every newspaper from here to Boston. You had every right to take it that far, and you chose not to. Why?" Evelyn considered this question for a long moment before answering, because she found standing there in the stable yard with the evening settling gold and quiet around them that she owed herself more precisely an honest answer rather than a convenient one. "Because I spent 8 months wanting to hurt you exactly as much as you hurt me," she said. "And somewhere in that locked cellar room, reading my father's letters by candlelight, I understood that revenge and justice are not the same thing, William, however much they can feel alike, in the moment you finally have the power to choose between them. I did not want to become a woman who destroys. I wanted to become a woman who is simply finally free." "And are you—" His voice had gone rough. "Free, I mean, now that it's done." Evelyn looked past him out toward the fields that stretched dark and quiet in the fading light. Her father's fields, her mother's house, a legacy that had nearly slipped through her fingers because she had once believed that loving a man meant surrendering the right to question him. "I'm beginning to be," she said. "It isn't finished yet. There's a great deal of work still ahead of me. William debts to settle wages owed a household to rebuild from the ground up. But for the first time in 3 years, I find I'm not waiting for anyone's permission to begin it." He nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders seemed to accept finally completely that whatever chance he might once have had to be forgiven had passed the moment he chose silence over honesty 18 months ago and every moment since. "I did love you," he said quietly. "In whatever broken way I was capable of it. I want you to know that before I go." "I believe you did in your fashion," Evelyn said. "But love without honesty is only a kind of theft, William. You took 3 years of my life believing myself chosen when I was only ever a solution to a debt you were too proud to admit to. I hope wherever you go from here, you learn the difference before you ask anyone else to love you again." He left the following morning without ceremony, a single trunk loaded onto a hired carriage. No grand farewell, no gathered household to see him off. Only Thomas standing at a respectful distance by the front door, and Evelyn watching once more from the library window, though this time there was no laughter preceding the carriage's departure and no smile on the face of the man climbing into it. She did not feel triumphant watching him go. She felt instead something quieter and more durable, the particular calm of a door finally firmly closing on a room she had spent 3 years trying to make into a home and could not. The weeks that followed brought a different kind of reckoning, quieter than the gathering's public drama, but no less demanding. Evelyn threw herself into the estate's accounts with an intensity that surprised even Thomas, who had known her since girlhood and had never seen her move through the world with quite this particular hunger. She paid the tenant family's first every dollar owed going back 3 months, delivered personally in most cases, because she found she wanted to see their faces when the debt was finally settled. Wanted to say in person that the silence of the past winter had not been her doing and would not happen again under her management. The Hollis family, whose eldest boy had gone without proper boots through the coldest months of the year, while wages sat unpaid in a ledger, William never bothered to reconcile, received their full back pay on a Tuesday morning. And Mrs. Hollis had wept right there on her own porch, gripping Evelyn's hand so tightly it nearly hurt. "We heard the talk, ma'am," she said, "about the trouble in the house. We didn't know what to believe." "Believe this," Evelyn said. "You will never again go unpaid under my management of this estate so long as I have breath to see it managed properly." She sold the mill not to the Ashford consortium, whose ties she now understood far too well to trust, but to an independent buyer in Alexandria that Mr. Pratt located after careful inquiry. A family concern with no connection to Richmond society at all, offering slightly less than the original bid, but coming. Evelyn found with a freedom the other offer could never have carried. The proceeds, combined with the extended terms Lord Ashford had granted, cleared the mortgage entirely within 4 months, 3 months ahead of even the generous new schedule. She did not do it alone. Thomas managed the household accounts alongside her, teaching her in the process 30 years of accumulated knowledge about the estate's particular rhythms and needs that no ledger alone could have taught her. Mr. Pratt became something between a solicitor and a friend, calling on the estate every few weeks, not merely for business, but increasingly simply to see how the work progressed. And slowly, through that long, hot Virginia summer, stretching into a golden autumn, Whitmore Estate began piece by careful piece to become something it had not been in a very long time. It began to feel again like home. It was in late September, the fields turning gold at their edges. The first cool evenings, finally breaking the summer's heavy grip, that Evelyn received a letter that made her sit very still at her father's old desk for a long while before she could bring herself to answer it. It was from William. Evelyn, I do not write to ask anything of you. I understand I have no right to ask, and I would not insult you by pretending otherwise. I write only because I believe you deserve to know, and because I have found in these past months that honesty comes rather more naturally to a man who has already lost everything he once thought honesty would cost him. The position in Richmond has gone reasonably well. I have learned rather belatedly what it means to earn a wage rather than simply spend one. It has been humbling in ways I did not expect, and instructive in ways I suspect I needed considerably earlier in my life. I heard through mutual acquaintances of the mill's sale, and of the tenant families being made whole at last. I confess, I felt something I am not accustomed to feeling when I heard it, not merely relief that the debt no longer threatens the estate, but something closer to shame, that it required your hand rather than mine to finally set things right. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Evelyn. I understand it is not owed to me, and I would not know in truth what to do with it if you offered it. I write only to say that I see now, with a clarity I lacked for the whole of our marriage, precisely what kind of woman I failed to recognize I had married, until it was already too late to matter. I wish you well in whatever comes next. William. Evelyn read the letter twice and then folded it carefully and set it in the same drawer where she had once kept a very different document, waiting for a signature that had taken 3 weeks and a room full of witnesses to finally secure. She did not answer it immediately. She sat instead by the window for a long while, watching the last light fade, gold and slow over the fields her father had built, and found that what she felt reading William's careful, humbled words was not triumph, and not quite forgiveness either, but something closer to peace. The particular peace of a woman who no longer needed anything at all from the man who had once held every part of her future in his careless, borrowing hands. She thought of Caroline somewhere in Richmond, now rebuilding whatever life remained to her after the wreckage of that summer. She thought of Lord Ashford and the strange, unexpected alliance that had grown out of his daughter's heartbreak. She thought of Mrs. Hollis, weeping on her porch, and of the mockingbird that had sung through every confrontation this house had witnessed since July, indifferent and constant, marking the passage of a summer that had changed everything. And she thought finally of the locked cellar room, and the 11 weeks she had spent there by candlelight, teaching herself to read a language of debts and deceptions she had never expected to need, and understood sitting now in the gathering dusk of her father's library, that the woman who had first pushed open that door had not survived what came after. She had become someone else entirely. Outside, Thomas's voice carried faintly across the yard, calling the last of the field hands in for the evening, and somewhere beyond the window, the first cool breath of autumn moved through the tall grass, carrying with it the smell of harvest and change, and a house finally quietly beginning to belong to itself again. The letter from William sat answered for exactly 9 days before another one arrived that made the first seem in hindsight like the smallest tremor before an earthquake. This one did not come from Richmond. It came from Baltimore, sealed with wax, stamped in a crest. Evelyn did not recognize. And when Thomas carried it into the library on a cool October morning, his face carried none of the careful neutrality he usually managed so well. "Ma'am," he said, "I believe you'll want to sit down before you open that one." Evelyn did not sit. She broke the seal standing and read, and felt the ground she had spent 4 months so carefully rebuilding tilt beneath her feet all over again. Mrs. Harrington, I write to introduce myself as Charles Harrington, first cousin to your husband, Duke William Harrington, and by the terms of the entail governing the Harrington title and its associated properties, the presumptive heir to that title, in the event William Harrington should fail to produce a legitimate son. It has come to my attention through channels I need not detail here that a separation has occurred between yourself and my cousin, and that you have in the months since assumed sole management of Whitmore Estate, its lands, its accounts, and its income, as though the property belonged to you outright. I feel obligated to inform you, madam, that Whitmore Estate, while it may have entered the marriage under your father's name, became entailed property upon your marriage to a titled peer subject to the same succession laws governing every other Harrington holding. Your separation from William does not sever that entail. It merely raises rather urgently the question of who is entitled to manage the property in his stead, given that he has no son, and given that I, as next in line, have both the right and, frankly, the responsibility to ensure it is not mismanaged into ruin by a woman with no formal claim to it at all. I intend to travel to Virginia within the month to review the estate's current condition myself. I trust you will receive me with the courtesy due a man who may within a matter of years hold legal authority over the very ground you currently stand on. Charles Harrington. Evelyn read it twice and then a third time, and felt something cold and furious rise up through her chest, in a way she had not felt since the night she first read her own name forged onto a loan document. Thomas, she said very quietly, send for Mr. Pratt, today, and find out everything you can about a Charles Harrington of Baltimore before he arrives here, believing this house is already halfway into his hands. Pratt arrived within 2 days and read the letter with the same grim, methodical calm he brought to every crisis, though Evelyn noticed watching him that his jaw tightened considerably by the second page. "Is it true?" she asked when he finally set the letter down. "Is Whitmore Estate entailed?" "That is precisely the question, Mrs. Harrington, and I confess I do not yet know the answer with certainty." Pratt removed his spectacles and rubbed at the bridge of his nose, a habit she had come to recognize as the outward sign of a mind working very hard. "Your father's will protected the eastern fields, the mill, and the townhouse explicitly in your name alone, which is precisely why those properties survived, William's mismanagement untouched. But this house Whitmore Estate itself, the land it sits on, was, as William told you himself, the night of the mortgage held under the marriage settlement rather than your father's separate protection. Whether that settlement created an entail tying the house to the Harrington title is a matter I will need to research very carefully and very quickly. And if it did—" Pratt was quiet for a long moment. "Then Charles Harrington's claim may carry more weight than either of us would like." Evelyn sat back in her chair, the same chair she had sat in the night William first read the separation agreement, and felt the peace she had spent 4 months building begin to crack down its center. "I have spent an entire summer and autumn paying every debt this family owed," she said slowly. "I have made every tenant whole. I have cleared a mortgage that would have ruined this house entirely. I did all of it with my own hands, my own late nights, my own understanding hard-won from a locked cellar room, and now a man I have never met writes to tell me none of it may matter because of an entail written before I was ever born. I understand the injustice of it, Mrs. Harrington. I share your anger, but injustice and illegality are not always the same thing, and I would be doing you a disservice if I promised you otherwise before I've had the chance to examine the original settlement papers." "Then examine them," Evelyn said, and her voice had gone hard now. The particular hardness that Pratt had learned over these past months meant she had already decided precisely how far she intended to fight. "Examine them tonight if you must. I did not survive William's betrayal only to hand this house to a stranger from Baltimore because of a clause buried in a document I never had the chance to read for myself." Charles Harrington arrived 11 days later, and Evelyn understood within the first 5 minutes of meeting him that he was nothing at all like his cousin. Where William had carried his confidence carelessly, almost cheerfully, Charles Harrington wore his like armor, precise, deliberate, a man who had clearly spent his entire life being told he stood second in line for something he believed quietly and completely that he deserved more than the man standing first. He was younger than Evelyn expected, perhaps 30, lean and sharp-featured, with pale eyes that moved over the house's furnishings, the grounds, even Evelyn herself, with the particular assessing coldness of a man conducting an inventory rather than paying a visit. Mrs. Harrington. He did not bow so much as incline his head the exact minimum degree courtesy required. I trust my letter reached you in good order. It did. Evelyn did not rise from behind the desk, the same small, deliberate discourtesy she had once used against Ezra Colt, and she watched Charles notice it, his pale eyes narrowing just slightly. Though I confess I was surprised to learn I had been managing another man's inheritance these past months, rather than my own late father's estate. I understand this must feel sudden to you. His tone suggested he did not particularly care whether it did. But the law is the law, madam, whatever inconvenience it presents. I've brought my own solicitor, a Mr. Aldous Finch, who will review the settlement documents alongside your Mr. Pratt, so that we may determine the true state of affairs without unnecessary delay. How efficient of you, Evelyn said, to bring your own man before you'd even confirmed whether a claim existed to investigate. Something flickered behind Charles's pale eyes, not quite anger, but the recognition of a woman who did not intend to be managed as easily as he had apparently expected. I did not become heir presumptive to a dukedom, Mrs. Harrington, by waiting patiently for opportunities to present themselves fully formed. I investigate. I prepare. And when the ground shifts in my favor, I am ready to stand on it. How fortunate for you, Evelyn said, that I have spent this entire year learning to do precisely the same. The weeks that followed became a quiet, grinding war fought entirely on paper. Pratt and Finch closeted together for hours at a time in the library, poring over the original marriage settlement drawn up nearly 4 years earlier, arguing points of inheritance law that Evelyn had never once needed to understand, until a stranger from Baltimore arrived to threaten the only home she had left. Charles did not stay at Whitmore Estate, choosing instead lodgings in the county seat, but he called nearly every other day, always with some new question, some new demand to examine a particular ledger or walk a particular field. And Evelyn came to understand, watching him move through her father's house with that same cold, assessing gaze, that he was not merely investigating a legal claim. He was measuring the house for the day he believed it would become his. "You've done considerable work here," he said one gray November afternoon, standing in the drawing room and studying the newly repaired plasterwork Evelyn had commissioned that autumn, paid for with the mill's proceeds. "Improvements, investments. I confess I did not expect a woman managing an estate alone to show such discipline." "You mistake me for someone who requires your approval, Mr. Harrington." "I mistake you for nothing, Mrs. Harrington. I simply observe that whatever the outcome of this legal matter, the estate you've built these past months is considerably more valuable than the one my cousin nearly destroyed. I intend to see that value preserved, whoever ultimately holds the deed." "How generous," Evelyn said, "that you've already begun planning its preservation before a single court has ruled in your favor." Charles smiled, thin and cold. "I find, Mrs. Harrington, that the world generally rewards the man who plans ahead of the ruling rather than the one who waits for it." It was Thomas in the end who brought her the piece that changed everything, not through any legal research, but through 30 years of quiet, careful memory that no lawyer's document search could have replicated. "Ma'am," he said, finding her alone in the library one evening in early December, snow beginning to fall thin and early outside the windows. "There's something I ought to have told you weeks ago when this Harrington business first began. I didn't think of it until tonight, going through the old cellar records again with Mr. Pratt." "Tell me now, Thomas." "Your father," Thomas said slowly, "never trusted the original marriage settlement entirely. I remember it clear as anything, ma'am, the week before your wedding. He sat up half the night with his own solicitor, not Mr. Colt, someone else, a man from Alexandria, whose name I never quite caught, going over every line of that settlement before he'd agree to sign it. I remember him saying near dawn that he wanted a second document drawn alongside it. A private letter of understanding, he called it, meant to clarify certain protections in case the entail language in the settlement ever proved broader than intended." Evelyn's heart had begun to pound. A second document. Where Thomas? Where would he have kept such a thing? "I don't rightly know, ma'am. But if your father went to the trouble of having it drawn, I'd wager my own pension he kept a copy somewhere close, Someplace only family would think to look. Evelyn sat very still for a long moment, her mind racing back through 11 weeks of candlelit nights in that locked cellar room, through every ledger and letter she had already read and catalogued and understood. And then slowly, she remembered a drawer in her father's old writing desk, the very desk she now sat behind every day, that had always stuck slightly, that she had always assumed simply needed oiling, and had never once thought to examine more closely. She was on her knees beside it within the minute, working the drawer loose with hands that had gone unsteady for the first time in months. And when it finally gave way with a groan of old wood, she found tucked beneath a false bottom, she had never known existed, a single folded document, her father's seal pressed into the wax, unbroken, after 4 years. She broke it with trembling fingers and read and felt tears rise hot and sudden in her eyes for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun. Private letter of understanding to accompany the marriage settlement between William Harrington and Evelyn Whitmore. I, Jonathan Whitmore, being of sound mind, do hereby clarify my intent regarding the disposition of Whitmore estate in the event of any dissolution, separation, or dispute arising from the marriage herein contracted. It is my explicit wish and instruction that Whitmore estate, the house its immediate grounds, and all appurtenances thereto, shall be considered a portion of my daughter's inheritance from her mother's family line, the Pierce family of Alexandria, and not subject to entail under the Harrington title, regardless of any language in the primary settlement document that might through careless drafting or deliberate ambiguity suggest otherwise. I make this clarification because I do not fully trust the intentions of the man my daughter is set to marry, though I have chosen for reasons of family obligation and the settlement of certain debts to proceed with the union regardless. Should my daughter ever find herself in need of protection beyond what the primary settlement provides, let this letter stand as clear evidence of my true intent, that Whitmore estate belongs to Evelyn Whitmore and her heirs entirely and without condition, regardless of what becomes of her marriage to William Harrington, or any subsequent claim made by his family line. Signed and witnessed, this 14th day of April, Jonathan Whitmore. Evelyn sat on the floor of the library, the document trembling in her hands, and wept not from grief this time, but from something closer to overwhelming relief. The particular collapse that comes only after months of carrying a weight one did not fully realize had grown so heavy. Her father had known. Even as he arranged a marriage, he did not fully trust even as he settled William's family debts and bought his daughter a title she had never asked for. He had built one more wall of protection around her, quietly, carefully trusting that if she ever needed it, she would find the strength to look for it herself. She had not disappointed him. Charles Harrington did not take the news well. Pratt and Finch reviewed the document together the following morning, and even Finch, Charles's own solicitor, was forced to concede after nearly an hour of careful examination that the letter's language was unambiguous, properly witnessed, and dated well before the primary settlement, sufficient in his professional opinion to establish clear precedent for Jonathan Whitmore's original intent, regardless of any conflicting language in the settlement itself. This changes nothing, Charles said when Evelyn showed him the document herself, standing in the same drawing room where he had once studied her repaired plasterwork with such cold calculation. A private letter undisclosed for 4 years, conveniently discovered the very week I arrived to press my claim. Forgive me, Mrs. Harrington, if I find the timing rather too fortunate to accept without considerable scrutiny. You may scrutinize it as thoroughly as you like, Evelyn said. The seal is my father's own unbroken until the moment I opened it in front of Thomas Reed, who has served this family for 30 years, and will swear to that fact before any judge in Virginia. The witness signature belongs to a solicitor in Alexandria, whose own records, I am quite confident, will confirm the date of drafting long before you ever wrote your first letter to me. And if I choose to contest it in court regardless, then you may, Evelyn said, meeting his cold, pale eyes without flinching, and you may explain to a judge precisely why you traveled to Virginia within a month of my separation, prepared to claim an estate you had never once visited in the 4 years of that marriage, the moment you believed a woman alone might be too weak to defend it. I do not believe that story will play as sympathetically in a courtroom as you seem to imagine, Mr. Harrington. Charles studied her for a long, silent moment. And something in his carefully composed face finally cracked, just slightly, revealing the calculation working underneath. "You are a formidable woman," he said, finally echoing, without any apparent awareness of the irony, the very words Lord Ashford had once offered her under far different circumstances. "I begin to understand why my cousin found himself so thoroughly outmaneuvered." "Your cousin outmaneuvered himself, Mr. Harrington," Evelyn said. "I merely stopped standing still long enough to let him." He left Virginia 3 days later, his claim quietly withdrawn once Finch confirmed through his own inquiries in Alexandria that the witnessing solicitor's records matched precisely the date on Jonathan Whitmore's private letter. Evelyn watched his carriage disappear down the same gravel drive that had carried away William and then Caroline and her father, and felt watching it go, a particular kind of exhaustion settle over her, not defeat, but the bone-deep tiredness of a woman who had spent an entire year fighting for ground that should never have been contested in the first place. She allowed herself that evening to simply sit by the fire in the drawing room and do nothing at all. No ledgers, no letters, no careful calculations for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always did in Virginia, the fields waking green by careful degrees rather than all at once. And Evelyn found herself, as the weather warmed, spending more and more of her days outside rather than behind the desk that had become over the past year almost an extension of her own body. She walked the eastern fields with the tenant families, learning their names properly, now not merely as entries in a wage ledger, but as the people who had kept this land alive through a winter of neglect and a summer of scandal. She sat with Mrs. Hollis on her porch some evenings drinking tea and listening to stories about her father that she had never heard before. Small kindnesses. He had shown quiet fairness. He had practiced a version of Jonathan Whitmore that emerged more fully now that Evelyn had finally become in her own right, the kind of steward he had clearly always hoped she might be. It was on one of these spring evenings, walking back from the Hollis farm, as the light went long and gold over the fields, that she found Mr. Pratt waiting for her at the house. An unusual visit for that hour, and something in his expression told her before he even spoke that he had not come merely for the pleasure of her company. "Mrs. Harrington, I've received word from Richmond that I thought you would want immediately rather than waiting for morning." Evelyn's stomach tightened, old instinct rising fast. "Is it William? It is though not in the way you might fear." Pratt's expression was careful, measured the particular caution he used when delivering news he had not yet fully decided how she would receive. "There has been an incident at the merchant house where he's employed, an accounting discrepancy apparently significant, involving one of the senior partners, rather than William himself. William, it seems, discovered the discrepancy during a routine review, and reported it directly to the firm's owners, rather than remaining silent, as I understand several of his colleagues urged him to do, given the senior partner's considerable influence within the firm. And the consequence? The senior partner has been dismissed, and criminal charges are being considered. William, meanwhile, has been offered a considerably improved position within the firm as a direct result of his honesty in the matter." Pratt paused. "I thought you would want to know, Mrs. Harrington, given everything that has passed between you. It seemed a rather significant change from the man who once forged your signature rather than speak an uncomfortable truth." Evelyn stood very still for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through her chest. Not quite pride, because she had no claim to it any longer, and not quite indifference either, because some small, stubborn part of her that had once genuinely loved William Harrington could not help but feel something like relief that he had finally chosen honesty when it cost him something real to choose it. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Pratt," she said finally. "I find I'm glad to hear it, whatever else remains unresolved between us." She did not hear from William directly again until midsummer, nearly a full year after the carriage had first rolled up the drive with Caroline smiling beside him. And when the letter finally came, it arrived not with the careful formality of his earlier correspondence, but with something rawer, more immediate. "Evelyn, I do not know if you have heard, but I find myself in need of writing to you, regardless, because I believe you above anyone else I know will understand the particular strangeness of what I am about to describe. I was offered 3 weeks ago a partnership in the firm, a genuine one, Evelyn built on merit rather than title. The first thing I believe I have ever earned entirely through my own honest labor rather than my name or my birth. I accepted it, and then found myself that same evening sitting alone in my rented rooms, weeping in a way I have not wept since I was a boy, because I understood all at once that I had spent 35 years believing my worth was measured by what I inherited, and I had just discovered quite by accident what it felt like to earn something instead. I write to tell you this, not because I believe it changes anything between us, or because I imagine you owe me any response at all. I write because I think somewhere in that year of ledgers and candlelight, you once described to me, you discovered the very same thing about yourself that I have only now begun to discover about myself, that a person's true worth has very little to do with what they were given, and everything to do with what they choose to build once everything they were given has been stripped away. I hope whatever comes next for you, that the estate continues to flourish under your hand. I hear even in Richmond that it has become something of a model for the county fair wages. Careful management, a reputation for honesty that I confess I never once thought to build while it was mine to build. I wish you well, Evelyn. Truly, and without any expectation in return. William. Evelyn read the letter on the porch that evening, the same porch where Caroline had once wept beside her, the same field stretching gold and green in the long summer light, and found that what she felt reading William's words was neither triumph nor lingering grief, but something quieter and more complete, the particular peace of watching two separate lives, once tangled together in deception and debt, finally growing into something honest, each in their own direction, neither one requiring the other's ruin to finally flourish. She wrote back only a short reply, 3 lines, wishing him well in turn, and did not expect nor particularly want anything further to come of the correspondence. The estate's harvest that autumn was the finest in a decade, the tenant families told her, gathering the last of the wheat under a sky so blue and clear, it seemed almost a deliberate blessing on the years-long labor. Evelyn walked the fields that September morning, alongside Thomas, watching the wagons roll in loaded heavy with grain, and felt for the first time since her father's death, 3 years before, something that could only honestly be called contentment. "You've done what your father always hoped someone would do with this place, ma'am," Thomas said, watching the harvest alongside her, his weathered face creased with something that was almost pride. "Made it thrive, not just survive." "I couldn't have done it without you, Thomas. Any of it." "Perhaps not," he allowed. "But you're the one who opened that cellar door, ma'am. I only held the candle." She laughed a real laugh, the first genuinely light sound she had made in longer than she could remember, and something in the easy warmth of it seemed to settle over the whole autumn afternoon like a blessing of its own. It was later that same week that Lord Ashford wrote to inform her the final payment on the mortgage had cleared in full 3 full months, ahead of even the generous revised schedule, and enclosed with the letter almost as an afterthought. A brief note that Caroline had asked him to include. Mrs. Harrington, I understand from my father that the mortgage is finally settled, and I found myself wanting to write to you directly, rather than simply hearing the news secondhand. I have thought of you often this past year. I have thought, too, of that evening in your garden, when you tried to warn me of a truth I was not yet ready to hear, and of everything that followed after. I want you to know that I have built a quieter life for myself since returning to Richmond. Nothing so dramatic as saving an estate, but a life of my own choosing, nonetheless, free of anyone's careless promises. I believe I owe a great deal of that quiet freedom to the example you set that terrible, remarkable evening. I hope, whenever this letter finds you, that Whitmore Estate continues to flourish exactly as fiercely as the woman who saved it. With genuine and lasting respect, Caroline Ashford. Evelyn read this letter too, on the porch, the harvest sounds carrying faint and golden from the fields beyond, and folded it carefully alongside William's 2 very different letters from 2 very different people whose lives had once nearly destroyed her own, and found that she could hold both of them now without any bitterness at all. Only the quiet satisfaction of watching wreckage slowly, carefully become something whole again for everyone the storm had touched. So, it was a full year to the day since William's carriage had first rolled up the gravel drive with Caroline smiling beside him. Evelyn had not planned it this way, had not even realized the date until Thomas mentioned it quietly over breakfast that morning, when a final unexpected visitor arrived at Whitmore Estate. It was William himself, unannounced, standing at the edge of the drive, rather than approaching the house directly, as though some old instinct told him he no longer had the right to simply walk through her front door the way he once had. Evelyn saw him from the same library window, where this entire ordeal had first begun, and felt her heart give one hard, startled beat before settling into something steadier. She walked out to meet him, rather than waiting for Thomas to announce him, and found him standing quietly in the drive, dressed more simply than she had ever seen him, his bearing entirely different from the careless confidence he had carried a year before. "I should have written ahead," he said before she could speak. "I only decided to come this morning rather suddenly, and I confess I did not entirely think it through." "What brings you back, William?" He looked past her at the house at the fields beyond it, gold and full with the last of the harvest, and something moved across his face that looked almost like grief. Though not Evelyn understood grief for anything, he still believed he was owed. "I wanted to see it," he said finally. "What you've built here. I've heard so much secondhand through Pratt and through Ashford, and even strangely enough through Caroline, who writes to me occasionally. Now business-like letters, nothing more, but enough to keep me informed. I wanted to see it with my own eyes before too much more time passed, and I lost whatever small right I might still have to witness it at all." "You have no right to it, William. Not any longer." "I know that," he said quietly. "I'm not here to reclaim anything, Evelyn. I understand better now than I ever did while I still lived here that I gave up every claim I once had the moment I chose silence over honesty. I'm only here because I wanted to see you once more and to ask you something I've carried with me this entire year and never found the courage to write down in a letter." Evelyn waited, saying nothing, watching him gather himself the way she remembered him doing once, a long time ago, before he asked her father for her hand. "Did you ever love me?" he asked finally. "In the beginning, before any of this. I've told myself for a year that whatever I felt for you was real, however badly I betrayed it. I've wondered just as often whether you ever felt anything for me at all, or whether I was only ever a solution to your father's arrangement, exactly as I was to yours." Evelyn considered the question honestly, the way she had considered every hard question this past year, refusing herself the comfort of an easy answer. "I love the man I believed you could become," she said finally. "The version of you I saw glimpses of early on, thoughtful, sometimes when you forgot to perform confidence for an audience. Generous once or twice in small ways, I don't think you even noticed yourself being. I loved that man William, or the promise of him, for longer than I probably should have given how rarely he actually appeared." She paused, looking at him steadily. "But somewhere in this past year alone in that cellar room, and then alone in this house, rebuilding everything you left in ruins, I learned to love myself more. And I find now that I don't particularly miss loving you instead." William absorbed this in silence, his jaw tight, and when he finally nodded, it was slow and complete, a man accepting a verdict he had known somewhere was coming. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair, given everything. I don't say it to wound you, William. I know you don't. I think that's precisely why it lands as hard as it does." He managed a small, rueful smile, the first genuine one she had seen from him in the whole conversation. "You were never cruel, Evelyn. Not once in all of this. I keep waiting to resent you for what happened, and I find I simply can't manage it. You only ever asked for what was already yours." They stood together for a long moment in the quiet autumn afternoon. Two people who had once promised each other a lifetime, and instead built out of that broken promise two entirely separate lives. One, rebuilding itself in Richmond through honest labor and hard-won humility. One rebuilding itself here in Virginia through candlelight and ledgers and a courage Evelyn had not known she possessed until circumstance demanded she find it. "I should go," William said finally. "I only meant to see it as I said. I've seen it now." "Thank you for coming, William. I mean that honestly." He turned to go, and then paused, looking back at her one last time, the fields gold and full behind her, the house standing solid and proud against the autumn sky, exactly as her father had built it to stand. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think he would be proud of you. Your father, I mean. I only met him a handful of times before he died. But I remember him watching you once at some dinner years ago with an expression I didn't understand then and understand very well now. He knew what you were capable of long before either of us did." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I found his letter, remember. He knew exactly what he was protecting and exactly why." William nodded once more and then walked back down the drive toward his waiting carriage, and this time Evelyn did not watch him go from behind a window. She stood in the open drive itself in the full autumn light and watched him leave with her own eyes open, feeling nothing that resembled the devastation of a year ago, only a quiet, settled closure, the particular piece of a story finally completely finished. So, that winter, Evelyn hosted her first gathering as sole mistress of Whitmore Estate. Not a grand affair, nothing to rival the disastrous summer supper that had once unraveled her marriage in front of 40 witnesses, but a modest Christmas dinner for the tenant families. The first of what would become, in the years ahead, an annual tradition that the county came to speak of with genuine warmth, rather than the pitying whispers that had once followed her name. Mrs. Hollis brought a pie. The Pratt family came. Josiah Pratt himself, looking almost bashful at being included as a guest rather than a solicitor for once. Thomas sat near the head of the table, not quite as a servant, and not quite as family, but somewhere warm and settled between the two, exactly where 30 years of loyalty had earned him a place. "A toast," Thomas said near the end of the evening, raising his glass with a formality that made Evelyn smile despite herself. "To Mrs. Harrington, who took a house nearly lost to ruin and built it back into something worth calling home." The room raised their glasses together. Warm laughter and genuine affection filling the space that had once, not so very long ago, held nothing but a locked cellar door and a woman alone with her grief. Evelyn looked around at the gathered faces tenant families made whole, a solicitor turned friend, a housekeeper who had wept with relief over settled wages, an old butler who had held the candle while she found her own courage in the dark and felt something settle deep and permanent in her chest. She had not simply survived what William did to her. She had not simply protected what her father built. She had become in the space of a single devastating transformative year precisely the woman her father's careful hidden letter had always hoped she might one day discover herself to be. Later that night, once the guests had gone and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Evelyn sat alone by the library fire, the same fire that had burned the night she first laid a separation agreement on the desk before an unsuspecting husband, and allowed herself finally completely to simply rest in what she had built. The mockingbird outside had long since gone quiet for the winter. The fields lay still under their first snow. And Evelyn Whitmore, for she had in the final settlement reclaimed her father's name entirely. A small, deliberate act of closure she had insisted upon. The moment the papers allowed it, sat in the firelight of the home she had fought to keep and understood with a certainty that no forged signature, no hidden mortgage, no cousin's cold ambition could ever again take from her, that she was at last and for the rest of her life entirely her own. She had not needed William's love to become whole. She had not needed revenge to feel just. She had needed only what she had finally given herself in that locked cellar room by candlelight, one careful ledger at a time. The unshakable knowledge that a woman's silence is never surrender, that patience is not the same as weakness, and that when a person finally decides to stop waiting for someone else to hand her the life she deserves, there is no power on earth strong enough to take it from her again. The fire burned low. The snow kept falling soft and endless over fields that had finally truly become her own. And Evelyn Whitmore closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt nothing but peace.